To quote Alvin Toffler, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And a learning mindset is the key for this. But what is a learning mindset, and how do you develop one? To discuss this, I caught up with Impact Senior Consultant and Global Practice Lead, Steven Nishida. So, Steven, thank you ever so much for joining us on In Good Company today. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you ever so much for giving us some of your time. Before we get into the main bulk of today's episode, let's give our audience the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. So what we do is we ask all of our guests the same question, which is to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I am Steven Nishida. I'm a senior consultant in the Impact Americas business, which essentially means that I lead the design and delivery of some of our most active global and our most long-standing clients in the Americas business. I'm also a global practice lead, which means that I head up and oversee some of our work internally on thought leadership and capabilities. So I get the good fortune of working on some of our big picture projects and really talking through sort of our propositions, our points of view, and how we develop our people.
Amazing. Now, how long have you worked for Impact now?
It's been a little over 8 years. And I guess
Right.
the other thing that I'll mention is that this is probably my third career. First as a language school owner in Japan, and then a university faculty also in Japan, where I lived for 16 years. And I learned the language and met my lovely wife. I have 2 teenage kids now, and we recently adopted a cat. Um,
Excellent. I bet that'll
I
be keeping you busy.
It does. It does. It keeps us very busy. It's like the sole focus of the whole family now, which
I
is
can
the way I
imagine. I
mention
can
it.
imagine.
Um,
Well, so let's get into it.
yeah,
Thank you for that.
sure.
Today we're talking about a learning mindset, and maybe what we need to do is just set that context a little bit. So, in your words, what is a learning mindset?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've given this some thought, and I think that it can be described in a few different ways. But the first and probably the one that really captures the way that I think about a learning mindset is an orientation towards curiosity and exploration and
Hmm.
future possibility. Right. And so, having this mindset means sort of staying grounded in those general concepts, those general ideas, and letting them sort of lead you in a direction um, at any given time, right? So that means that you don't always know exactly where you're going to go, but you, as we say here at Impact, you let the learning lead,
Hmm.
and that sometimes means that you're moving into uncharted territory for yourself, which can be quite uncomfortable for people,
Hmm.
but in your heart and in your mind that the journey is going to be worth it ultimately, right?
Hmm.
And part of this requires, as I mentioned, an openness to not knowing and not having the answers, which can be quite not just uncomfortable, but I think that it can feel quite counterintuitive to us. We've sort of been educated and sort of grown up in our workplaces to want to demonstrate our knowledge or our
Hmm.
ability. And so being able to let go of that is something that takes a little bit of practice and getting used to, getting comfortable being uncomfortable, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
I,
go ahead.
I think that's interesting and kind of from what you're saying, I would imagine that it's a learning mindset can be from anyone, no matter where they sit within an organization. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And what I love about this is that it's like right down to the most sort of basic fundamental human level, right? Like
Hmm.
we can all nurture and follow our curiosity and allow it to lead us. Now, it can't be willy-nilly, right? We can't just be only following our curiosity at all times, right? We still need to get the work done, and we still need to meet the expectations that we've set with others for the work that we'll be doing. um, but I think that being able to sort of hold that orientation towards producing results alongside an orientation towards learning and following your curiosity is really important. The other thing that it does for you is that it helps you to do something that is quite difficult for most people, which is suspending cynicism, right?
Right.
We often really get tied to some of our pre-existing beliefs or ways of doing things. And so we will tend to be resistant and even cynical of new ideas and new ways of doing things.
Mm,
And so it becomes very much about letting go of this expert, or what we sometimes call a judger mindset. There's a great author named Mary Lee Adams who introduced the concept of learner versus judger mindset, and specifically talked a lot about related question styles, and how
mm,
you can get more from your interactions with others by being really clear about what you're trying to achieve. Are you approaching this with more of a learner mindset, or are you approaching with more of a judger mindset? And so
mm.
again, it's getting out of that mode where I feel like I need to have the answers, I need to be the expert, that can start to unlock the possibilities of what we can learn together.
So let's maybe do a bit of a scene setting then. Can you describe an example, if you like, of where a learning mindset is beneficial to both, or either a leader, a team, or an organization? Is there any sort of examples that you can set there?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that it's, having a learning mindset, it encompasses almost every moment that you're in as a leader, as a worker, because it's so important to be able to hold these two things at the same time, right?
Mm,
This performance orientation, and also this sort of learning and growing orientation. So I'll just say that to start with. But specifically, I think that what we tend to do when we face a problem is reach into our bag of tricks of things that we've seen that have worked for us before,
mm,
or an answer that seems to have met the moment for us before. And when we do that, we are, yes, leveraging our historical knowledge and how things have worked in the past, and we're limiting ourselves in terms of what the possibilities of the solutions could look like.
mm,
And so just taking even a moment to really understand what question you're trying to solve, and let your curiosity about what is this problem exactly? Is it similar enough to the problems we've solved in the past in this other way,
mm,
that we should apply that solution again? We don't ask ourselves that question enough.
mhm,
It's a form of what we call double loop learning, right? Where we can get sort of stuck in this loop of trying the same process over and over again, and only monitoring what the results of that process are, rather than looking back at a second loop of what is that whole process based on? What assumptions did we have? What beliefs went into us forming that? And so sometimes going back that extra step can really help to open up what's possible for us and others in the work that we do.
yeah, that's really interesting. I was, I kind of like, as you've been talking there, listening and kind of thinking about like physical examples where even if I've gone through my own career, like of where having that, because I could completely recognize times where I've had more of that judger mindset and kind of thinking I know best, but actually in many ways, you need to accept the fact that having that learning mindset kind of opens that opportunity to either do different work or do better work. So in terms of from a leader position, then what role does a learning mindset have in the leadership toolkit?
Yeah, it's there are two levels of this, right? I'd say, first is individually, right? So leaders themselves are put in this very unenviable position where, um, in order to be successful at what you do as a leader, you really have to be able to recognize and meet emerging needs and challenges, which requires new knowledge, new skills, new capabilities of
Mm,
you. And so, as an individual, you have to be prepared to learn with agility, and that requires a learning mindset. Um, at the same time, because you're a leader and because you are serving others who you are working with, and who are perhaps reporting to you, or you're working collaboratively across the organization with these others, um, it's really important that as a leader you have the ability to identify what gaps in knowledge and skills and capabilities there may be, and really think through how to close those gaps quickly and intentionally. And that all has to happen in the flow of work, because nobody has
Mm,
time to take a time out and go and have an offsite to discuss the strategy for it all. You really have to develop it into your practice of how you lead and how you work.
mm,
So it's a really important competency that all successful leaders will need to rely on, and currently even now do need to rely on.
mm,
But I believe that it's sort of increasingly true as we move into moments that are just riddled with disruption, right? It's
mm,
sort of the only way to future proof ourselves against the disruption is to make sure that we have a learning mindset and are able to act adeptly with learning agility.
mm. Have you got any examples or any stories that you can share of where you've either worked with a team or an individual or a leader that where they've they've kind of had more of a judger mindset in the past and started to embrace a learning mindset and had success there? Have you got any stories you can share there?
Well, I think maybe the most fundamental stories. I've got one. We were working with a very senior leadership team in a particular region in North America.
Mm,
They're in the financial services industry, and we had come in sort of in the aftermath of some relatively unsuccessful change interventions that had taken place. There was a big new change initiative. It wasn't really being taken up. People said that they understood it, but they weren't really changing their behaviors in ways that the that the CEO wanted to see.
right.
And it was really difficult to see what from the CEO's standpoint, it was difficult to see what's getting in the way and why is this
Mm,
happening. And we were able to run a program that sort of got into talking through an experiential exercise. We were able to uncover some of those more judger mindsets, right? So less learning mindset uh, contributions from some of the participants, and able to sort of probe and ask questions about where is this coming from, and how, what might help you to get past some of this.
mhm,
And one of them asked me a very similar question. They said, can you give me an example of how this is supposed to change things for us at all?
mhm,
And I happened to have been taking furious notes of what was being said from the moment that we all came together in that session. And this particular individual had kind of sat down, and within 2 minutes of talking to his colleagues, said, yeah, well, this is another one of those offsites, and we're nothing's really going to change. So I don't have a lot of faith that we're going to see anything different.
mm,
So and and it really struck me that that was the approach that he decided to take, right?
mm.
Because in the course of the 3 days we were together, it was clear that he cared so much about the organization.
Sure.
He cared so much about his people. He wanted to see his colleagues succeed and feel more comfortable, but they were stuck in this place where they were just doing things the way that they had before.
Mm,
And worse, they were becoming mired in this kind of toxicity and dysfunction. And so I was able to just point out for him and say, do you recall when you walked in what you said immediately when you sat down? And he hadn't, and other people had. And I said, what do you think that does to the tone and the expectations of those around you? You're quite a senior person, obviously, with a lot of credibility and a lot of sort of gravitas. People listen to you and they look to you. And I think that if we can really stop getting in our own way by sort
mm,
of putting these sort of stakes in the ground in places that are holding us in a place that we don't want to be in, then we
mm,
can really start to unlock the potential that we have together. Um, that was a risk for me to point out to him, especially in a group setting like that
mm,
among his peers. And fortunately, he really took the feedback on. And by the end of it, and he sort of stood up to the group and said, this has really opened my eyes to some behaviors of mine and some ways I've been looking at things that I think are really blocking things for us.
Mm.
And what's fascinating is I mentioned that Mary Lee Adams had done the work on some of these question styles to help us to differentiate. What people will probably be more familiar with than the phrase learning mindset is growth mindset,
Mhm.
which of course was popularized and brought into the mainstream by Carol Dweck. Um, in this distinction that she has between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, one of the key differentiators for leaders in particular is how those individuals look at change. And so someone with a more of a fixed mindset is going to tend to view change as a threat. And
Mm.
someone with more of a growth mindset is going to tend to view change as an opportunity. And so being able to sort of paint the guardrails and let people explore with these ideas and these distinctions. In this particular example that I'm giving you, it would really help to open things up for them because they realized that they were the ones that were sort of becoming the antibodies in that immunity to change,
Yeah.
that were really resistant to what was new and what was coming in because they were so stuck on the old ways of doing things and the old ways of engaging one another.
And out of interest, if you kind of kept up to date with where they're at now compared to where they were when you worked with them?
Um, yes, I mean what we know is that group did get past what was keeping them in place, and
Yeah.
I don't know the specific details of that individual and sort
Mm.
of where they're at themselves, but I know that we had a few follow-up email exchanges where he was quite generous in his praise for how impactful those moments in the
Yeah.
sessions together were. And so it's sometimes it's so hard to see what's right in front of you and
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
your own sort of the things that you're bringing to a situation can be and how they can be getting in the way.
And it's we often talk about pivotal moments at impact, and it sounds like that
Mm,
was one for this individual, like where
yeah,
they've just just by you challenging them, in a respectful way,
sure.
that you were able to completely change that person's thinking on how they approach new, as you say, opportunities and changes and challenges and things. And I'm sure that they will reflect on that moment for still now, and just the way they approach it. So it's it's fascinating. And I always like hearing these stories because where it's in real life situations that we can learn from that as well.
Yeah,
Because
and
all the way through this conversation, I've even, as I say, been sort of going, how did I approach this, and could I be any better? And
right, right.
yeah,
Yep, yep. And that's the thing is that we often say in the work that we do that we have a pull style of facilitating, right? Because we're trying to
mm,
draw the learning from others. I can't do that work for that person or
mm,
for anybody else. My role is to sort of call out what we're seeing and to start to paint a picture for what else might be possible besides that. Help people to see where they may be getting stuck, and then start to show what other avenues there might be or ways of thinking.
for
And
sure.
these mindset conversations are really helpful for some people.
Well, you've neatly led us on to my next question, which is to for our audience listening or watching to this, the I'm going to just redo that last line. So yeah, for our audience that are either watching or listening to this, like it would be really great to hear some kind of practical advice that they can take away from this, from you about how as a leader can they develop and grow that learning mindset.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're really basic things to start with, right?
Sure.
I mean, I think that these are some of the things that you hear people get into when they start to look at sort of systems leadership and some of these really big topics that are out there. I think that it can be overwhelming, but what's really heartening is that the sort of most notable writers out there on these topics, they get it. They said, look, everybody's got to start somewhere. Here's where you can start, right? And from my perspective, it starts with things like this, right? Listen more,
Mm.
talk less, right? um you've got this cliche thing that people say that I think is a good reminder, right? You have two ears and one mouth, so be using using those ears to listen more, and use that mouth only to talk when it's necessary and useful.
Mm,
Also, there's some great work that's come out of behavior analysis, as a methodology, that we do on some of our programs as well, and it shows that there's really a a lack of particular behaviors that are really useful in many business settings, even among leaders who are very strong in other capacities. And those behaviors are seeking reasons, right? Seeking reasons and rationale about,
mm,
like, why do you believe that? What is behind that idea that you're proposing right now? Trying to understand it rather than thinking of what I want to say next or what I want to introduce, or worse, just a cynical view of how to rebut what that person just said, right? It's like, let
mm,
me try to really understand, because if we do really understand, then I'm learning something along the way. Importantly, I'm learning more about the perspective that my colleagues have, which helps us all to work well together and to learn and grow together, which is hugely important. There's a great quote that I often cite on programs, by an Indigenous elder in Canada. His name is
mm,
Sakej Henderson. He says, "To truly listen is to risk being changed forever." And I think that this just captures so much of what we're talking about here, right?
yeah.
Are you really listening to your colleagues? Are you really opening your mind to the possible in this? The other thing I'd say is, it sounds so obvious, but when people talk about humility and approaching leadership moments with vulnerability, it's so much about letting go of your ego, right? If you
Mm,
can distance yourself from the need to be right again, right? The need to sort of be the person who gets the credit or comes up with the best idea, and really just think about what serves the group and the needs of the group at a given time, you're going to be in a much better position to not just show up well, but you're also going to be in a position to, again, not keep going down those same pathways that keep you stuck in a place that isn't particularly helpful, or in any case gets in the way of learning and growth. um, the last thing I'd say is, surround yourself with people who are ferocious in their pursuit of curiosity, right? So you always recognize who's around you, right? What kind of
mm,
influence do you have around you from the people that you surround yourself with, whether it's in your work life or your personal life? And if they're not people who are passionate about and sort of ferociously in pursuit of their curiosity, then you're going to tend to follow the same kinds of thinking and pathways, and you're going to tend to get the same kind of guidance from them, that may have been not serving you well in the past.
yeah.
And so, looking to really do that in the circles you work in and play in, can be really helpful, and it's very simple stuff that everybody can do.
Well, sure. I mean, even as we've been talking through now, I've just started by questioning myself. What approach do I have? What mindset do I have? And I think I'll be going away from this just starting with that question. But it's been really awesome talking to you today, Stephen, about all of the aspects of a learning mindset, and I found it a fascinating conversation. I have one final question for you, which is a bit more
Yeah.
of a personal one,
Okay.
and it's one we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is, if you were to start your career again, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self?
The timing of this question is really funny, because I just talked with 6 classrooms full of high school kids on career week last week,
All right.
at my alma mater, right? So sort of going back to where I actually studied and talking to kids, it was surreal. But here's what I'll say about it, and sort of what we came to across those conversations last week. Um, say yes to every learning opportunity early on, right?
Mm,
When you're young, you just don't know. And it was one of the things that I really empathize with young people, because they feel like they are expected to know what path they're going to go on, or what career they're going to be in, or what they're good at, or what they like doing. And you can't know until you try stuff. So
mm,
just say yes to every learning opportunity early on, and then increasingly start saying no to those choices that don't really give you energy, or are not a good fit. I learned that eventually, but it took me a little while. I kind of
Mm,
got really focused at a certain point. I got really focused on things that I had demonstrated, you know, high performance in, for example, like excellent results in, and it got me more into that sort of expert or judger mindset than I probably needed to be in for a time. And then I think once I was in college, I got to sort of explore it again. And the most important learning, I think, this is the last point that I'll make about this, is that um, people don't usually equate learning with letting go, but I think it's
mm,
probably the most important thing that you have to become good at in order to make sort of transformative changes in the way of learning and growth. Avoid dogma, right?
mm,
Often the hardest things to let go of are some of your previously held beliefs, or your air quotes best practices of before. And it's a tough lesson to learn,
mm.
especially those first few times. But it gets easier with practice, and so lean into that, and don't be afraid of the pain along the way. It'll be worth it.
It's so funny listening to you talking about learning as we are younger, and I think it's inherent in children, and
Hmm.
to just learn. They're constantly learning, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like, yeah, we reach that age where we start to question more of what we decide to learn or not, as it but we're always learning all the time. I think it's just when we apply that. And it's been really interesting, and I always think, particularly it resonates with me because of I have a 4-year old who's
Mm.
constantly learning all of the time. um and so, yeah, and you can take a lot of inspiration from that as well, I think.
Yeah.
um Sorry,
Yeah.
go
Oh,
on.
no, no, I'll just share one thing. It's related to parenting, and especially to raising kids. I
Mm,
also coach high school wrestling in my spare time. But you were always thinking about these kinds of things. I talked about how um, I became really fixated on sort of the things that I was good at and what
mm,
I had received praise for. Some of the early work that Carol Dweck and her team of researchers did on growth mindset was actually focused on the inverse impact of praise. And so they did these studies on kids, and they would tell them either after, so they would give them an easy test, and they'd say either you did really great on that, you're so smart, or you really did great on that test. I appreciate, and I think it's great the way that you stuck with it even when it was hard. And they praised
mm,
them for their
mm.
effort as
Yeah.
opposed to how smart they were. Those kids who were praised for being smart wanted to hold on to that title and that status. And so when they were asked in the next instance, would you prefer to take another test the same level of difficulty or something more challenging?
Mm,
They chose the same level of difficulty because they were afraid to risk losing that, as opposed to the other kids who had been praised for trying hard and sticking with it.
mm,
They were like, yeah, give me the next one, give me the harder one. And it really shows something that I noticed in myself as I was telling you that story of getting caught in my own sort of judger mindset and expert mode, that it's really important how we engage our kids and how we talk to young people, because we
yeah.
can get them fixated on trying to hold on to some identity or some status that they think they've attained, when what they really need to do is just keep trying things and
Mm.
keep learning and figuring out what works for them.
Well, and I would sort of agree and say that I think that applies to teams and leadership within teams as well.
Yeah.
That same behavior uh, can resonate throughout those places as well. Stephen, it's been awesome and amazing and very insightful talking to you today, and I thank you very, very much for joining me. Is Before we do go, is there anything that we've not asked you that you'd like to mention?
Good question. Well, I just think that this is the foundation that so much sits on. And so I'll be really eager to hear some of the other podcasts that you all record, and to just be a part of the conversation about how it all fits together. Because I'm in this field personally because being a great leader happens to have a lot to do with being a great learner, and
Mm,
having the ability to create environments in which others thrive, not only in the high caliber results they can produce, but also in the learning they can achieve, especially together, because that unlocks so much of what's possible for people. So yeah, I'm really excited about what's coming. I think it's great that Impact's doing this, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Amazing. Well, Steven, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of In Good Company. If you would like to find out any more about Impact or the work we do, or perhaps you'd like to explore our leadership playbook, then you'll find all of the links that you need in the description of where you found today's episode. So thank you very much for tuning in, and until the next time, take care.